Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. My name is Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist. And this video is the second installment video that deals with Chapter 1, Philosophy and the Framing of Translational Science, in my new book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science, published with Oxford University Press in August 2026. So in the previous video, I talked about science as a moral enterprise, the aspiration that science should be a moral enterprise. And in this video, I'm going to focus on some of the comments and discussion in Chapter 1 of knowledge versus wisdom, an important distinction that's critical to ensuring that science actually stays the course of pursuing morally laudable aspirations. And in the video that will follow this one, I will discuss Mary Shelley's depiction of translational science in her excellent novel, Frankenstein. The distinction between knowledge and wisdom is critical to the argumentation that I deploy with respect to longevity science, and I rely upon an excellent book by Nicholas Maxwell, a philosopher of science, From Knowledge to Wisdom, where he makes a distinction between knowledge and wisdom inquiry science. The kind of quick take-home message is that wisdom inquiry science is concerned with the kinds of questions that we see here in this passage, right? It asks what kind of science, technology, scholarship, and education is best designed to help us promote human welfare and realize that which is genuinely of value in life. And this passage actually informs in a very serious way my own teaching and research. I actually approach the pedagogy of my own seminars with Maxwell's insight in mind. All right, so most of my students learn very little, if anything, about the importance of well-ordered science for the future of humanity, and they really don't learn anything about aging. So I take it as a prime directive of my teaching to ensure that students in politics are aware of population aging, both its amazing successes and opportunities, but also its challenges, to ensure that we regulate science in a way that puts us more in the direction of wisdom inquiry science rather than knowledge inquiry science. So Maxwell encourages us to scrutinize the ends and priorities of scientific research. I think to most people outside the philosophy of science or outside the scientific enterprise, your default assumption would be that scientists are always promoting the most morally laudable aspirations. You don't realize that there's a lot of special interests in functioning within the scientific and academic community. All right, so I've been in higher education for 3 decades. There's a lot of advocacy and special interests, just as there are in all other domains. That's not to say these can't also align with promoting morally laudable aspirations, but they need to be scrutinized and rigorously studied. So the aims and priorities of scientific research must be intelligently chosen so as to help relieve human suffering and promote human welfare. And I think in particular, in an aging world, we need to really reevaluate the aims and priorities of biomedical research. And we want to avoid that we're merely kind of chugging along in a way that is designed to promote interests that historically were aligned with the wisdom of promoting the general good, that was aligned with the wisdom of ensuring that human populations can flourish, to one that is designed to just facilitating scientific research, but yielding diminishing health returns. And my criticism of the ideal of disease control in the context of a world where populations are surviving past the 7th decade of life is that the aspiration to fully understand every disease and to create and to try to conquer each disease one at a time is more about promoting scientific and academic community interests than it is in promoting the health of the population, because the goal should really be to extend the health span, not to try to delay mortality into later and later stages of life, thereby bringing about more debilitating conditions such as Alzheimer's disease. So this was captured in the introduction of the book as the tale of The Journey Through the Ocean of Longevity. Winslow's framing of translational science as launching a war against disease was certainly a wise presupposition to adopt in the early 20th century during the age of pestilence and famine and the age of receding pandemics. It still has a lot of wisdom, but it also has limitations because now the most prevalent diseases that are responsible for human mortality in the world are the chronic conditions of later life, such as cancer and heart disease. And so in stage 2 of that tale, I talk about, the transition from lifespan to healthspan. This is in the 4th stage of the epidemiologic transition, the age of delayed degenerative diseases. So the cover image of the iceberg represents biological aging and the fictional imagined harms of, the Frankensteinification of translational gerontology. And, there's a real danger that the war against disease approach, if we ignore the role that aging plays in contributing to the onset of disease, frailty, and disability in late life, it will dissolve into knowledge inquiry science, where we simply are trying to learn everything we can about cancer to keep cancer research going, not necessarily improving quality of life for older populations, which really is what the end game should be. So it's not that I think we should abandon the ideal of disease control, but we need to recognize both its success, but also its limitations. And that then will allow us to pivot in the critical way that we need to ensure that the ideal of rate control becomes more prominent in terms of our aspirations for biomedical innovation in the 21st century. So what are the implications of this distinction between knowledge inquiry science and wisdom inquiry science for longevity science itself? In a world with high rates of early life mortality, the science of delaying death certainly constitutes wisdom inquiry science. For all of human history, the ideal of disease control was the foundation to wisdom inquiry science. It's only now that populations are surviving into the upper bounds of human longevity that we need to start to rethink how wise it is to continue to try to delay mortality through the 8th decade of life, given the onset of multimorbidity during that stage of the human lifespan. So in a world where life expectancy has surpassed the 7th decade of life, which it currently is, delaying mortality risks dissolving into knowledge inquiry science. That is, if we lose track of what it is that we should actually be trying to do, which is improve quality of life, not simply delay death. Delaying death from early life mortality confers many decades of healthy longevity on the children that survive from polio and smallpox. But the same is not true for most of the cancer mortality that occurs after age 70. This will mean that higher portions of the population will survive for more debilitating conditions such as Alzheimer's and dementia. So here's a contrast between two aspirations for biomedical science. The first articulated by Winslow in The War Against Disease, but that one has remained kind of the sole aspiration. And in The Tale of the Ocean Through the Journey Through the Ocean of Longevity, that's represented by the ship's captain who says we're going to keep steering ahead even when the iceberg of biological aging is visible and responsible for most of the waves of chronic disease that are pummeling the steamship of public health. Whereas the other aspiration, like 50 years later, we have Willard Thompson championing the aspirations of geriatric medicine, that everyone wants to live to a ripe old age in a state of good health. Right? It's not simply living as long as you can, but rather about having quality of life during the duration of life, and ideally a compression of morbidity at the end of life. We've dropped the ball in terms of updating our aspirations. The field of gerontology and geriatric medicine has been on the margins, but it needs to become much more central to the aspirations of medical science if we hope to actually improve quality of life in later life. Another key distinction that Maxwell makes between knowledge inquiry science and wisdom inquiry science concerns its attitude towards pure and applied science. Knowledge inquiry science makes a sharp distinction between these two things, whereas wisdom inquiry science doesn't make such a distinction. It says that even in the pure science, it should be oriented towards what he calls the problems of living. And this, I argue, is what translational gerontology, certainly the experimental branch of it, is trying to do. Researchers are studying caloric restriction in rodents and developing drugs to extend the health span, because that would be very relevant to narrowing the growing health span lifespan gap, which globally is nearly 10 years of life. So wisdom inquiry science is much more contextual in its normative aspirations, that it actually looks at the problems of living in the world today. And in the book, I try to amplify a number of distinctive 21st century challenges that biomedical innovation should be trying to redress. And finally, the third point that I'll mention with respect to the distinction between knowledge inquiry versus wisdom inquiry science that Maxwell notes concerns its attitude towards politics. That is, for knowledge inquiry science, it's often described as purely being concerned with facts and knowledge. It's apolitical. But I work in a politics department, and everything is political, and certainly science is political. I mean, you just have to turn on the evening news, and you'll see somebody advocating either for some certain scientific innovation or against it, and that can range from genetically modified crops to vaccines to artificial intelligence and also to longevity science. So wisdom inquiry science sees science as part of the moral and political enterprise, and politics is an integral part. And that certainly is a distinctive feature of the ethical analysis I deploy for longevity science, is to look at how the politicalization of science impacts, for better and for worse, our orientation towards longevity science. So wisdom inquiry science conceives of the scientific enterprise itself as inherently moral and political endeavor, one pursued to discover and advance what is most of value in life. And this is very important for the aspirations of rate control, because one of the reasons it has been marginalized for decades is its inability to make serious traction in the political domain. As Len Hayfleck pointed out many years ago, nobody has officially died of old age in the United States since the early 1950s, when old age was removed as a cause of death. So because delaying death is the central aspiration of the war against disease, and aging is not a disease, so if nobody dies of aging, it receives a small financial investment compared to research that's trying to conquer heart disease, cancer, or Alzheimer's. An article by Alderman noted back in the 90s, Alzheimer's disease, which is only one disease of aging, receives the lion's share of public funding compared to research on the biology of aging, which could have a real impact not only on our risk for Alzheimer's disease, but heart disease, stroke, and all the other age-related diseases and disabilities that older populations are prone to. And in a future chapter, I'll do a deeper dive into the war on cancer. And similarly, cancer research has been prioritized over research on the biology of aging. And yet the biggest risk factor for developing cancer is getting older. Where the funding goes is influenced by the role of our imagination in terms of the aspirations of biomedical science. So because we conceive of the morally laudable aspirations as conquering disease, the lion's share of public funding has been allocated to the war against disease. And when it comes to healthy aging, this has not had as much traction and doesn't as vividly capture our imagination. And so it's received a smaller amount of public funding. And furthermore, as I'll note in the next video, because of the ambiguity about what the aspirations of translational gerontology are, the human mind is prone to what I call the Frankensteinification of translational gerontology. So in the next video, when I talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, there'll be lots of lessons we can learn from that novel that will help us think more rationally about the likely societal impact of innovations that help us slow biological aging. So that is it for this second video on knowledge versus wisdom. In the final video for chapter 1, I will talk about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and the lessons that we can learn about how to frame translational science.